And here we have our next instalment of Mr. Penguin and the Fortress of Secrets. And today we are starting with chapter 17, which is titled Yet Another Bumpy Landing. Mr. Penguin squeezed his eyes shut and tried to ignore the fierce wind whooshing all around him. On his shoulder, Colin was grinning madly. He glanced behind him, then tapped Mr. Penguin's forehead. "I'm not looking at anything until we've landed, Colin," yelled Mr. Penguin. But Colin kept tapping until Mr. Penguin had no choice but to open his eyes. Colin was pointing his leg towards the village. A knot of residents were standing watching them go, including Edith and Dieter, who were jumping up and down and waving encouragingly. Then Mr. Penguin saw what had caught Colin's eye. The mysterious danger in black stood in the shadow of a King Ludwig von Klonker statue. He was just as Colin had described, sinister and creepy. As Mr. Penguin watched, the man took one last look at the cuckoo plane, then disappeared into the gloom with a swish of his leather coat. Mr. Penguin groaned. Not only was he flying into goodness knew what peril at the fortress, he'd left two of his friends in danger. It was at this point that Mr. Penguin made the mistake of looking down. Oh, they were high. So far, in fact, that they were even above the clouds, with only the large and icy tip of the old Grandfather Grim mountain for company. Mr. Penguin clamped his eyes shut again. "Mr. Penguin!" cried Liesel. "We need to land! Pull the lever!" But poor Mr. Penguin couldn't pull anything. His flippers were frozen stiff with terror. Crash! Crunch! The cuckoo plane smashed into a clump of frozen trees and bump, bump, bump down through the branches. Crunch! It hit the ground and chucked its passengers out most impolitely. They tumbled across the snow before coming to an abrupt and silently ouchy stop against a boulder. Thwack! Mr. Penguin stood up first and straightened his bow tie. His head was all wobbly and spinning. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," he cried, glancing over at the cuckoo plane. "We won't be able to get back to the village. Look, it's ruined." As they looked at it, one of the wings broke off, the propeller crumpled, and one of the eyelids started doing a weird wink twitching thing again. Mr. Penguin started waddling around in circles, flapping his flippers and groaning miserably. He only stopped when Colin lobbed a frozen pine cone at him. Liesel stood next to the wrecked mechanical bird and eyed it up calmly. "This isn't good," she said. "But I might be able to fix it. I'll have to if we ever want to get home." She rummaged around in the plane's bottom and pulled out a little toolbox. "So could you pack this?" she said. "I'll stay here and get fixing. You two will have to go to the fortress without me." Mr. Penguin gulped. He wasn't sure what was more worrying, being trapped on this freezing mountain or facing whatever was inside. "Go on," insisted Liesel, rolling up her sleeves. "It's getting dark and we don't want to be stuck out here for the night. We might be gobbled up by ferocious bears. As Mr. Penguin fussed with his bow tie again, an image of Gordon in his hamster costume flashed into mind. His friend was probably feeling frightened too. "Okay," he said, "let's go." The climb to the fortress was very steep. There was nothing left of the ancient path, and the snow came up to Mr. Penguin's bow tie. So Colin Kung Fu kicked, kapow, a track up the mountain. "Thank goodness you're here," Mr. Penguin said through his chattering beak. "Otherwise, I'd be really stuck." A blizzard began swirling around them. It was like being shaken in a snow globe as they tried to trundle upwards. But then the storm stopped, and suddenly the fortress was revealed. A monstrous weather-beaten building with an enormous black iron door looming above them. "Doesn't look very welcoming, if you ask me," said Colin's pad. "I agree," said Mr. Penguin, shivering. "Looks very dangerous," said Colin's pad. Mr. Penguin nodded. "Very dangerous indeed," said Colin's pad. Then, without breaking eye contact with Mr. Penguin, Colin slowly underlined the word very with a thick black line. "All right, Colin," said Mr. Penguin. "No need to go on about it." Mr. Penguin waddled slowly up the crumbling steps. Colin stashed his pad away and followed. With a trembling flipper, Mr. Penguin knocked on the door. No answer. "Oh dear," he said cheerfully. "Looks like no one is at home. We'll just get Lizzle and fly back to the village. Come on." And he turned and ran back down the steps. But Colin wasn't going to be beaten by something as silly as a heavily defined, reinforced, solid iron door. He furrowed his monobrow, took a deep breath, and kapow! There was a dreadful clanging sound, and the door opened with an ominous groan. It hadn't been locked. Curiosity got the better of Mr. Penguin, and he found himself climbing back up the steps. "How strange," he whispered. "If you were up to no good, why on earth would you leave the front door unlocked? Anyone could just wander in." Little did he know that he was just about to find, in a very alarming way. My plan is simple. I am going to take over the world. I spent my childhood performing for the rich and the powerful, and now I think it's high time they performed for me. How thrilling it will be to have everybody under my spell, doing my bidding forever. So it looks like at the end of that chapter that we can link the two parts of the story together now. The Mr. Penguin part and the bit that's usually in grey at the end of some chapters. We can now see that they are linked. Let's see what happens in chapter 18. Chapter 18, The Moving Floor. Uh-oh. Just as Mr. Penguin and Colin crept through the door, a sudden blast of howling wind slammed it shut behind them. Somewhere in the darkness above them, there was the clunk of a bolt dropping home, and Mr. Penguin trembled. They were now locked inside the fortress. It was pitch black at first, but slowly Mr. Penguin's eyes became accustomed to the dark. He saw they were standing at the top of a set of stone steps that led down to a cavernous hall. It was icy cold in the room, and had they been able to see properly, they'd have noticed their breath billowing from their mouths. Mr. Penguin squinted. Something on the far side of the hall seemed to be glowing. He squeezed his eyes, almost completely shut. He could just make out another door, with a yellowy green light spilling through the cracks around the doorframe. "I think we need to head over there," Mr. Penguin whispered, pointing with a flipper. Colin nodded, and they walked down the steps together towards the glowing light. Mr. Penguin was first to set foot on the ground, but he quickly jumped back onto the last step. The floor of the entrance hall was springy and rubbery. What on earth was it? He could hear a gentle hissing sound coming from somewhere nearby, like someone had turned a tap on. Surely some mad person wasn't standing in the darkness turning on taps. I mean, I like a nice hot bath, thought Mr. Penguin, scratching his beak, but not in a terrifying fortress up a mountain in the middle of a blizzard with no lights on. I wouldn't be able to find my rubber ducky. He shook himself and remembered they were here to rescue their friend, and hopefully all the stolen rodents too. It was a very important rescue mission. Mr. Penguin straightened his nice hat and tried walking on the floor again. This time, the ground hissed angrily and started to slither and move all around his ankles. Mr. Penguin leapt back beside Colin. He gulped. Just then, a shaft of moonlight slipped through one of the windows and lit up a nice, thin slice of the room. Mr. Penguin could finally make out what was beneath him. There wasn't a mad person running a bath. Oh no, it was something worse. Much worse. The entire floor was covered with slithery snakes, all hissing and wriggling about angrily. There were small snakes, big snakes, and some snakes so gigantic they looked as if they'd be able to swallow Mr. Penguin in one big gulp. Snakes! Cried Mr. Penguin as he and Colin hoofed it back up the steps. Why did it have to be snakes? The snakes turned as one of the two intruders and licked their chops. Uh-oh, said Colin's pad hopefully. Do something, Colin, yelled Mr. Penguin, tugging at the door handle. But it wouldn't budge. Before we end up as dinner. But what could Colin do? They were trapped. Their only chance of escape seemed to be a glowing door on the other side of a room full of hungry serpents. Of course, Colin could run about biffing them all on their noses. That would be fun. But there were an awful lot of snakes, and he might not be able to save his penguiny friend from becoming a very tasty snack. Mr. Penguin was doing his panicky dance, running back and forth, flailing his flappers above his head, when he suddenly slipped and fell into something dry and papery, hidden in the darkness. Help! He cried. Colin, help! It's got me! Colin leapt over to his friend and untangled him. It didn't take long, but once Mr. Penguin was free, he lay on the step, quivering so much that the arrow in his hat wouldn't stop. Boinging about, Am I still alive? Said Mr. Penguin, one flipper clamped to his forehead. Have I been eaten? Colin didn't answer. He was too busy examining the object that had trapped his friend. He grinned. Aha, said his pad. And then, of course, he turned to Mr. Penguin and I have a plan. And that's the end of chapter 17 and the end of our book for this week. I look forward to reading the rest of the book with you next week. Keep safe and keep washing those hands.